Be right back. Destroy is an independent podcast produced by Be Right Back Studios. Every episode is supported by our listeners on Patreon, including Tim O'Donnell and Roy Burns III. More information is available at patreon.com/destroypunkpodcast.
To take an iconic image of the Queen of England, the most powerful figure in the UK, on the year of the Jubilee, and disrupt it, to do something that attacked that in some way, was incredibly exciting and subversive.
I think that juxtaposition is very interesting. The shock value is there of these almost religious things, which we hold as important, being destroyed or undermined to make us think again.
I remember when I was buying these records, I would go into a room and I'd play the records, and the visuals would amplify the music for me. It would draw me into the music even more than the music itself. And the two of them together, for me, it was a revelation.
You thought you'd gotten rid of us, didn't you? But you were wrong, old bean. Because we're back with a vengeance.
God save the Queen, my son.
On the 27th of May, 1977, the Sex Pistols released God Save the Queen. It was their second single on their third record label. The cover was an official portrait of Her Majesty the Queen Elizabeth II, defaced and torn. Her eyes were blocked out. Her mouth was cut away. The image was instantly recognizable. It was pageantry as provocation, graphic design as seditious revolution. It caused outrage.
This group are leaders of a whole new teenage cult that seems to be on the way to being as big as mods and rockers were in the 60s.
The cult is called punk, the music punk rock, basic rock music, raw, outrageous and crude.
One London newspaper called them the most aggressive, nasty band ever.
It not only changed the face of dissent, but also the means by which to question authority.
I wouldn't call it rebellious. So all I'm doing is expressing myself. This ain't a free country. Sex Pistols should have the right to free speech.
In this episode, we look at how graphic design became central to punk's cultural revolution. Beyond the music, the clothes, and the safety pins. We hear from Jonathan Barnbrook, the graphic designer whose work spans music, typography, culture, and politics, on why design is never neutral.
Whatever commercial field you're in, especially in design, you have to be part of the system. But I think the authenticity about being true to your soul, that should be the guiding light.
We talk to Andrew Crivine, collector and archivist of punk and new wave graphic material, on why these sleeves, posters, badges, stickers, and fragments of printed culture deserve to be understood as art.
I love music like I couldn't live without music, and people today, they're buried by this legacy of all this amazing music. How do you find your own voice?
And we also hear from Russ Bestley, designer, writer, historian, and co-founder of the Punk Scholars Network, on how punk graphics were actually made and why the mythology is more complicated than the cliches.
I'm one of those people who wants to understand how something works.
My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm an art director and a filmmaker. Welcome to Destroy.
You have to destroy in order to create.
Surely you can understand why we feel ashamed. Why do you feel ashamed? Just because I don't want to follow like everybody else. You don't think you look ridiculous? No, and my friends don't think I look ridiculous. And they're the ones that matter.
I was a teenager in the mid-70s and punk was receiving a lot of negative press in the newspapers that my parents were reading. My mum was quite outraged from reading the news of the world about these shock horror stories of what was going on. And as a rebellious teenager, that's an appealing idea. And I'd hear things secondhand on the telly about how disturbing this youth cult was, and was fascinated by this thing, what this thing might be. And I was often in conflict with my parents, and I found I was attracted to this thing from that perspective.
I remember going to Acme first, I think in the summer of 76. And then in 77, I went and I spent the whole summer in England. But that's when I became marinated in punk rock. And there was a few bands I really loved growing up, and one of them was The Who. But then when I came to England, that was the era of prog rock. And I never liked any of those groups. I just couldn't relate to a lot of the people who liked that stuff.
My dad worked as a scientist with the Ministry of Defence, and so he wanted me to go down that route. So I was kind of pushed into this engineering thing. I was told by one of the lecturers that having green hair and a leather jacket was not conducive to studying engineering, and that I might be influencing other students to take drugs. Even though I didn't take drugs myself, I was a bad influence, apparently, from the way I looked.
When I went to England, I basically would hang out with my cousin John. He founded Acme Attractions and then Boy on the King's Road. I'd kind of just drive around London with him when he'd go pick up inventory to bring back to the shop. And at the time, Don Letts and Jeanette Lee were still working at Boy. They had a little record player and they would play the Clash's first album in rotation. And at first, I'm thinking, this is noise. I can't understand what the guy is. Who is the singer? I can't understand any of the words. But then by day 3 of just being exposed to this record multiple times, I kind of said to myself, wait a minute, this is like the greatest record of all time. I was electrified. It was like basically having a volt of 50,000 volts going through my back. And I realized this is like the greatest record. This is what I've been looking for.
In the mid-70s, there's a rhetoric about punk and independence and control. A lot of those things were filtering through the zeitgeist. As a 15, 16-year-old, I'm not sure how much of that I understood. But I think the idea about anyone can do it, and the idea about do it yourself, you don't need to go through formal channels, was the thing that became ingrained in a generation. That's, to me, is the impetus, and that's the great legacy of punk, the idea that not necessarily that the amateur is better, or that the untrained have some sort of nuance and skill that's wiped out of them by the professions, but the idea of having a go and having a confidence to have a go.
Every generation creates their own interpretation of punk. I know it sounds cliche, but it really is that attitude that you can just express yourself, just do it, and don't be intimidated. If you're not technically very competent, just feel free to express yourself and get it out there.
And that's something that pushed me to try different things and say, yeah, I can have a go at that, I'll try it, rather than feel insecure and not of the right status or the right qualifications.
But none of the people involved thought it would last more than a year or two and they'd be on to something else. So for me, I think I was pretty alienated. I was angry. I didn't have a lot of self-confidence at the time. And I was really attracted to punk and the energy, the exuberance, the aggression. It was all just great.
I went to art school, which was funny enough where I met McLaren. But after that, I set up this community printing press, and we used to print a lot of very radical and anarchistic situationist material, and it gave me that ability to mess about with things. And it was really then that I established that whole look that became punk.
To take an iconic image of the Queen of England, the most powerful figure in the UK, on the year of the Jubilee, was provocative, yes. And I think it was provocative because of the wider cultural circumstances where it existed. Jamie Reed was reusing a lot of the work that he'd done at Suburban Press. He was adapting a lot of that process and that the situationist-inspired material for the branding of the Sex Pistols. As a youngster, he wasn't art and design trained, It was disruptive because it was interfering with, we're seeing the Royal Jubilee mugs and the Jubilee bunting and the Jubilee commemorative plaques and plates and everything else. And to do something that attacked that in some way was incredibly exciting and subversive.
There is a beauty in destruction. That's the beauty of punk. If you see an image that is of cultural worth being destroyed, there's a reassessment of what that image means. Also, there's a beauty in destroying it. The fact that people get so upset, that juxtaposition is very interesting. But the shock value is there of these almost religious things, which we hold as important. They're being destroyed or undermined to make us think again.
To a big degree, a lot of bands, it was just provoking the World War II generation and sort of getting back at the parents and getting back at their teachers and the hierarchy of British cultures.
How it works graphically beyond that, I think as we've taken a long view on this and come into the contemporary and look at where we are now with the idea of détournement, the idea of taking a powerful image and subverting it, it's become a stereotype that's heavily used in branding, advertising, heavily used graphically, but has lost that visual impact.
You know, you couldn't afford lecture sets, so you cut things out of newspapers, use photos, this, that and the other, and do a lot of collage.
Everybody's aware of the cliche stuff. The Ramones' first album cover, Unknown Pleasures. There's certain iconic graphics. Originally, there was sort of an orthodox, narrow framework. It was very monochromatic. It used certain graphic elements, which then became a common language.
But then we can take the idea of punk graphics and say, well, it's a very broad church. It's not just that visual language of the Sex Pistols. That was unique, almost entirely unique to Jamie Reid and the Sex Pistols. So you talk to Malcolm Garrett, he didn't want to make graphics that looked like the Sex Pistols. He was a designer that wanted an identity. There were the bands he was working with that was different, still innovative and still radical and still twisted in some way and still antagonistic, but it wasn't copying what Reid was doing. Reid's work was incredibly powerful. I'm a huge fan of Jamie Reid's work, but it kind of exists in isolation compared with a lot of other punk graphics.
With these exhibitions, you can see the evolution unfold. It's very eclectic. You see this range of design and of different designers and artwork, and a lot of it's a revelation.
I just had this idea to do a magazine, you know, and I produced like the first UK punk fanzine. I mean, the first issue, it was, I basically typed most of it out on a little children's typewriter, and I used a felt tip pen for the headings and all that. I think my girlfriend, she helped me out. She had a photocopying work. So the first issues were printed with my girlfriend's photocopier. It was very much in the do-it-yourself, you know, the ideals that punk was supposed to be about. You know, anyone could have a go.
Back in the 70s, nobody had any money. You weren't overstimulated the way you are today with media. Basically, kids in both America and England, they had to entertain themselves, right? They had to create their own world also in terms of whether it was art or music or sport or whatever. They had to do it themselves.
What excites me was the bending of the rules or the breaking of the rules, and the idea that as soon as something becomes an accepted set of standards, then we move away from it.
I go back to this thing of authenticity. You have to be authentic to yourself, and you have to be authentic to the time you're born in and grow up in. When someone picks up a piece of graphic design, it's the message. It's not, this is a piece of graphic design. And that, for me, I always found so refreshing that people came to it with not the pretense they would of art. So there was an honesty in design in that it didn't have any value.
Punk is an attitude. It's basically just saying get on with it and get your vision out there.
That's why we have punk using the medium of the time, which of course looks very visually attractive, but I'm sure the original idea wasn't to make stuff look cool. It was, how can we say this message? And very importantly, it was infinitely reproducible. It could be one piece of work, But what design always does, whatever it is, it works with the technology of the time. You know, in the Middle Ages, we're talking about first movable type. Now we're talking about digital. A good designer will use those to disseminate a message as well as they can.
In the 60s, George Melly, who wrote a book about turning the vogue to style, about pop music and radical pop music. How do we take something, a concept, and turn it into something material? As a designer, I was always really interested in the process of design. So you take an idea or a concept, which in punk terms is something like do-it-yourself or autonomy or the kind of control over process. And then you enter into a profession where you have to work with a chain of controlled steps towards getting something printed. So you have to work with the typesetter, or you have to work with a photographer or a plate maker, and all of these people. How does an amateur deal with that? How does someone coming from our college deal with that? How do you take an idea of do-it-yourself? How does it express itself visually? Is it a set of instructions, or is it a concept? So Buzzcocks did Spiral Scratch. It was very famous as the first DIY punk release. But there was nothing really on that record, on the packaging of the record, that explained that. Then the next step is people like Desperate Bicycles writing songs about making a record, and with sleeve notes on the back that say, we made a record, it cost this much, now it's your turn, you go and do it. And then Squitty Politti putting a set of instructions of how to make a record and what all the steps are and how much they cost. That I find really fascinating. There's a visualization, actualization of DIY. So on the one hand, we've got things that look rough and ready, the cheaply made fanzine, a sniffing glue or whatever it might be, ripped and torn, and there's an immediacy to it. And then you've got things like records and things like more complex objects. How have they got to that stage? And that I've always found fascinating.
The conversations on this show do not end with each episode. At shopdestroy.com, we curate an archive of books, records, prints, and related material connected to our guests and themes. More information is available at shopdestroy.com.
So the idea about creativity comes from restrictions and defying conventions. And I think Malcolm Garrett is really good at that. He's always been good at that. So let's take a concept, whether it's the idea of the record as a two-sided object, and how do I make a record sleeve that wraps around halfway around the record or something so that it demonstrates this idea of it's got two sides, or it's a three-dimensional object, or a round object. I like that about his work. It was very different to a lot of the other material that was coming out surrounded by punk, but it was quite unique.
I was ambivalent about modernism. So whilst a lot of my work was grid orientated in the classic Joseph Muller-Brockman tradition, it also had a willfully random component in the Brian Eno tradition.
I remember when I was buying these records, and then I would go into a room and I'd play the records, especially when I was listening to Joy Division in particular. You'd have the record sleeve with you. I guess it would draw me into the music even more than the music itself. And basically, the graphics, the visuals would amplify the music for me.
I mean, when he did the magazine cover for Correct Use of Soap, he was going to do a white vinyl, so white vinyl record like a bar of soap, and then he wanted it inside the packaging, and it would be shiny on the inside and matte on the outside. There's a lot of playful, really witty, playful games there that are ironic and disruptive. I mean, putting the giant United Artists logo and a catalogue number on a record sleeve rather than the record titles, or putting the album in a carrier bag that says product, just as a two fingers up to the record company.
Each generation subverts the meaning and messages of the previous generation. And when you look through the work of David King, Jamie Reed, of what was good about it was produced with what people have around them. If you're somebody who wants to say something to the community and you use a photocopy, it really was the start of being able to reproduce things cheaply and simply.
The rapid changes in social relations and the design and print professions at the same time as punk hits, and there's a happy coincidence in some ways that leads to some of those outcomes. But I think many of these changes were driven by technological change and accessibility that were leading us along these routes in any case. The idea about putting more control in the hands of the user or the creator is something that was changing and was happening quickly through the late 70s and early 80s. There were vehicles that enabled people access to tools of reproduction, the tools for making images and reproducing them. Those things were happening anyway, irrespective of punk. So the idea that there's a kind of photocopy revolution doesn't really happen until slightly later on. They're expensive things you couldn't enlarge or reduce on a photocopier until the early 1980s. And then you get Terry Jones producing Not Another Punk book, and then ID magazine with the colour photocopier and moving the image on the glass plate between scans so you get different sort of colour overlays and things. Very clever manipulative work that was done through a mechanical device, and that invention allowed him to do that.
So what I'm interested in is anything which goes beyond the fear control and supports people who are presenting a positive way to crack the fear control, which is holding down a generation.
We always try to approach things that something that's going to be more true to the product, to the record, to the music. It's enough to intrigue, to want to take it home, to find out a little bit more inside, on the inner sleeve, and then on the label. We never approach things from that angle. We never consider creative ideas pushed to one side for the sake of the one that would sell.
As punk evolved, you had punk and then you had new wave and you had these other genres. The palette became much broader. The universe broadened. What designers were drawing from became more ambitious. And I think also the designers became more prominent. And really, starting with punk, you have the situation where designers became essentially members of the band.
When I talked to Malcolm Garrett years ago, he was describing this kind of divide between the professionals and the behind-the-scenes art directors and the design studios at the labels and at the major labels, and then his generation of newcomers who were attached to the band.
They felt they could express themselves. They felt they could distill the music graphically. This is why Jamie Reed, obviously the Pistols, Peter Saville, the Joy Division, and New Order, they could translate the music into visual terms. And as the designers rose in prominence during those music scenes, what happened, especially with punk, finally the record sleeve became an artistic format in a way. In the 60s, you did have a handful of bands who could afford to hire the best graphic designers. You had the Beatles with Peter Blake. You had Pink Floyd with Hypnosis in the 70s. But in general, those were the exception. But especially with punk and new wave and post-punk, the designers became much more integral to the overall work. And I think they became more confident. I think the designers, as they demonstrated their value to the musicians, they then could express themselves. They started to feel more autonomy.
Just because you're offended doesn't mean you're right. So fuck off.
When I became a graphic designer, I always felt there was something about the transaction which was dishonest. And I suppose that's a fundamental problem with capitalism. But I always believe in telling the truth, but not being provocative for the sake of it. So I think the authenticity about being true to your soul, that should be the guiding light, whether you're punk or whatever political persuasion you are, really. I grew up into a world where design really was completely separate from that. People wouldn't talk about things like politics or what your product was doing to the world. And to me, that was a lie. The political landscape in this country moved because of punk. The landscape in this country moved because of the anti-Nazi League. That was all a relationship between music, graphics, politics. So that time was incredibly fruitful and almost a period where everything was working together.
I think the Pistols were actually quite political too. I think John Lydon, without question, basically, screw the past. We're going to start with a clean slate. But then not just start down, build something back, build something new. Some of it was just bands that had a good eye and were great pop bands too, who kind of took on the energy, especially with a lot of the new wave groups, where they took the energy of punk, but didn't necessarily take a political approach. Then there were bands who were definitely very political, obviously anarcho-punk, Crass and Poison Girls. And behind that, I think there's an element of a reaction to the failed utopianism of the hippie era. But a lot of these people didn't want to let go of that. They still wanted to have a vision for a better, more humane future. So especially with the Gang of Four, I would say, really attacking the power structures of British society.
To me, why is the first question. When you start designing every single day, why? And it's a question that's conveniently forgotten because it'll get you sacked usually. But for me, it was so fundamental. And that's why I started working with political groups, and I saw it could work. This idea that you're in a society, you don't contribute anything to it, I find very, very strange. And as a graphic designer, you have a duty to tell the truth. It's very important to acknowledge this aspect of design because your soul will die if you don't. And so when you look through the work of David King, Jamie Reed, what was good about it was the authenticity. The boldness of punk was terrifying.
And there's one great example in the collection. It's for the Skids. So they did this record, Days in Europa, and the design was pulled very quickly by Virgin Records. It triggered a very negative response by the elder generation. It's basically a Ludwig Hohlwein German poster for the Olympics from 1936, where you have these two Teutons and Days of Europa. And I think the goal was really to just agitate people with it, using that design. So in a way, I mean, it's interesting, it's problematic because there's a lot of flirtation with fascist imagery throughout as well with punk. But with that one, it's a very sophisticated poster, and it's meant to aggravate and to upset and take delight in that.
I think in the end, the point of a nihilistic punk act, or any act that's nihilistic, you live in a society, you have to interact with it. And ultimately, it's about communication amongst other human beings. So doing it for yourself, of course, has validity, but also contributing in some way, whether it's your point of view. That's the basis of democracy. You know, saying what you feel is both very important and something we have to uphold as well. But on another level, good ideas and the process of doing them never changes. Every time you see a letter form, the paper it's printed on, the context it's in, the time the typepage was designed in, what the words say, they all affect the meaning and the legibility. It's very difficult to know nowadays what the landscape is for people affecting change. Obviously, it's mainly digital and the way people organize themselves. But I do believe you have to keep expressing your opinion, because fascism, when it takes control of people, it's like a disease. It's a sickness, and you have to try and pull people out of it. It's very, very difficult. And one of the questions that people often ask me about the activist work is, show me where you've changed something. And of course, the world doesn't operate like that. But that doesn't mean to say you should not keep saying what you believe. You don't always have to say it in a straight way. You can whisper it, and it can be just as effective as shouting it. Now, I know a lot of designers will disagree with that, but it's the channeling and the filtering. There is the carbon offset idea that you can actually work in somewhere commercial and use your time, your free time, to do something worthwhile. It's about saying something and just using what you have, which is the basis of punk, you know.
See the film that incriminates its audience. The great rock and roll. Sex Pistols. They stuck a safety pin through Her Majesty's nose and turned the national press.
Are you part of the great rock and roll?
The rebellious spark of punk was never rebellion with a big R, although it made a huge, significant cultural change in the 20th century and 21st century. I think I don't read it as a sort of a major rebellion. Where I get a little anxious is when it gets expanded to become just a loose term that can mean rebellion. So we end up with branded punk power tools and punk yoga classes and all sorts of bizarre things that just the word punk is slapped on something to say, oh, it's a bit different, or it's a bit rebellious, or it's a bit alternative.
We do kind of idolise these people, Malcolm Claren, Vivienne Westwood. And some of them were quite clear, you know, they wanted the money. If you miss that point of the sellout, then it becomes just another movement that gets worshipped. Ultimately, the sellout was empty, which I think is one of the most interesting aspects about punk. They politically understood that they were being manipulated. And okay, we're being manipulated. You all see what's going on here. Why don't we get some of the cash as well? So I think that was an important political statement for punk. Now, I think a lot of people who look at punk only like to remember the first bit. But the second bit of the sellout is just as important because it was political, the selling out, in not just, hey, we're selling out, but they were doing it in the most cynical way possible.
Where I'm cynical is where punk allows itself to be tied down and says, okay, it's picture postcards of people with Mohicans and studded leather jackets and it sounds like this. And I think it doesn't need to sound like that at all. It can sound completely different, like the Johnny Rotten thing about moving with the times and not being tied down, rather than sticking with a set of conventions which are this then repeated ad infinitum. It becomes a brand that I don't think it should ever have been. I think that's where it is a real stretch to me, is that you end up with branded materials or products that are somehow branded punk. And it becomes over time a sort of stereotypical visual reference points or audio reference points that it didn't need to be.
So that's one of the processes of capitalism. Everything that's slightly outside of it is drawn in the service of it. So much so that it's not even discussed in the first place. I do remember I went into an advertising agency and I noticed there was a big stack of Adbusters in the desk. And I said, how come you've got that? And they said, there's some fantastic ideas in there that we can use. So on one level, that's very cynical, but on another level, good ideas and the process of doing them never changes, really. It's a weapon of social change when people use it for marketing, you know, but we have to remember it can be a weapon of social change when people want to say what they're unhappy with as well. It's all the same elements that are used, the same ideas in advertising, the same ideas used by activists.
There's always been a class struggle against the ruling class to get fair justice and fair dibs. And it's been going on for hundreds of years. And by knowing about that history, you can know that that needs to be sustained and it will go on. That's what people do. Each generation tries to struggle for a better world, one way or another.
The question I sometimes get asked, where does punk or where does rebellion or where does activism fit now? I think the seeds are still there. The idea of individuals or people wanting to upset the apple cart, wanting to have a voice, wanting to disrupt, wanting to show their passion for something or against something. And I think that's one of the great things about punk, is the idea about a non-directional refusal, which I think to me appeals. And that sort of ties in with whether it's anarchy in the UK or whether it's later on with Crass or whatever it might be, these ideas of subversion, but that subversion is still not really directed in one linear way, is something that's implicit. And I think those things will materialize. I don't think they're going to be done through things like social media channels. I don't think they're going to be done through AI. I don't think they've done through these kind of corporate structured communication channels. There's obviously shifts towards more interest in grassroots organisations. There's more interest in getting back to nature. There's more concern about things like the climate crisis and people wanting simpler lives. So maybe that's where there's an opportunity, where people start interacting more on a human level rather than a machine level. I think we all want to sometimes throw a stone in the water. We always want to disrupt something because that's a natural human condition.
covers were not about selling the music. The record cover existed in its own right. It didn't have a job. Their complete non-functionality enabled them to become art for their specific audience.
We live in a world of very high anxiety, and people are scared and anxious, and we have an economic crisis. It's conditions like this also inspire people to create art and to express themselves and to take those emotions and put them into something. And we saw that in the 70s in Britain. It's a strong echo. They're never identical, but I think the conditions are there for people to really try to come together and create new work, new great work. And punk, it really is eternal. I'm a proselytizer for punk graphic design as art. And because the 50th anniversary is a key marker in culture, it usually takes about 50 years for a cultural movement to be recognized to join the Academy of Fine Art. And I think we may be on the cusp of that with punk. And what I love about the collection is that it is sort of the Magna Carta or the Constitution. It's the source document. And nothing pleases me more when I'm at an exhibition to see how young people look at the material. You know, we're so overwhelmed with social media and with easy access to infinite knowledge in this fucking device. It's very sad, but I think technology has jaded people. So I guess I want the collection to liberate people to a degree. It's basically showing that art can be a force for good and can inspire young people and get them to get scissors and markers and pens and just create stuff. So a huge motivation for me is that I think this work is so inspiring. Any work that triggers emotional responses, whether positive or negative, I think is art. I think art is there to provoke and to inspire. And I think a lot of this work is beautiful. And I think there's not enough beauty in the world. And if I'm having a bad day or if I'm upset, if I look at some of these works, I just feel better. As with music, art can be healing. It can get us through life. Art, humor and art and music, we couldn't live without them. And I think people today, they're so saturated with data and everything is so easy to acquire. I think that it desensitizes people. I'm not a creator. I just think all these designs are so amazing and I just got to share it with the world because when we're gone, we're forgotten. And it only lives on in the imagination, in the heads of future generations. So it's trying to get that nourishment to them while I'm still on this earth.
Living on a croft in the yard of Lewis. And I got a message from Malcolm saying come and work with me on this sort of interesting new project. Which turned out to be the Sex Pistols.
This episode of Destroy was written and produced by Be Right Back Studios. Music was composed by Tokyo Iconic. Thank you for listening. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker and art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download. Be right back. The archival audio used in this episode of Destroy is taken from a variety of unknown sources Every effort has been made to use these clips responsibly concerning their original creators for the purpose of education, commentary, and tribute. All rights remain with the original rights holders.